Today we've got Tom Shepherd from the UK, and Tom does amazing wildlife paintings in watercolor, obviously. That's why we're here. But he actually just launched a new book, which he's going to talk about in just a second. But yeah, Tom, if you want to go ahead and Ethel can show the slideshow.
Yeah, if you want to dive into the slideshow.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
And yeah, thanks, Ashley.
Okay, hang on. Let me just disable some parts.
Oh, thanks, Emmy.
So, and welcome to a lot of, we notice there are new names in the room today. So welcome to everybody. If you're a first timer here, please do not be don't be shy to ask questions. We have a wonderful guest artist today. If you feel like a little shy, it's okay. You can just type in your questions in the chat as well. Okay, so this is our slideshow now. I'm just making sure that everybody gets to follow Tom. Meet our guest artist, Tom Shepherd, a beautiful.
I'm wearing the same jumper in that photo.
And do follow Tom on Instagram. Easy to remember, that's his name. Just add artist at the end. Also, of course, he is. Oh, this should be you. This is YouTube. No, this is Facebook. And his beautiful website, tomshepherdart.com. And special mention again, this is the cover page of his newly launched book, which also includes his signature dot card for this particular book, the Simply Paint Birds palette. And of course, on the next couple of slides are your sample artworks. And everybody here, of course, would be happy to hear a line or two for each of the works here. We start with this piece.
Yeah, okay, so this was actually a demo I did online probably a few years ago now, but it's always been one of my favorite paintings because I think it's a great example of what tonal values can do and light and shadow, because when you look at the light and shadow, it might not initially look like it, but the pattern of light and shadow is quite simple and the tonal values are quite simple. But when you have that framework of tonal values, this is a great example of what you can do with color and what you can do with the paint and how you can really play to the natural kind of characteristics of watercolor, the way the colors flow, dropping more opaque colors into more transparent colors. And it's all going to make kind of some sort of sense, when you have that kind of underlying light and shadow. And for me, this is a great example of that, the kind of the playfulness and the creativity that watercolor can be, but still grounded in like kind of some level of theory around tone and light and shadow. Yeah, and then this was always another one of my favorites that I've always enjoyed, kind of for the same reason. Like a subject like this has the potential to be so complicated, not only to paint, but also the end result can almost be overly complicated and overly fussy when we have all of those markings and everything like that. And I think it's another good example of the power of tonal values. It's quite hard to see, but if you were to take all of the spots off this, actually the pattern of light and shadow on the animal itself is very, very simple. There's kind of a couple of large areas of shadow, stick an eye in, and that's kind of enough to make sense of it. It's also a good example of how I like to sort of exaggerate color. That's probably fairly obvious to see, but I love to kind of take the colors that are there. And this one was very warm, lots of those reds and oranges and kind of hot yellows. But I like to then exaggerate that. If it is very warm, can I exaggerate that warmth even further? Maybe enhance the light a little bit. And then probably very finally, one of the things that I love to do in watercolor is I love to paint the shadows a little bit more fuzzy and wet into wet, so they have that lovely softness to them, almost adds a bit of atmosphere and depth. And then where the light is hitting, tend to have things a little bit more defined and hard edged. And I think this is a good example of those sort of don't have to do it like this, but it's how I like to do things, that kind of softer, fuzzy shadows, and then a little bit more definition where the light is hitting. This painting, Tina, is like double half sheet. Yeah, about half sheet. And then the previous one was A3 size, which is what, 31 by 41 centimeters. Yeah, and then that little shot of blue in the background that just kind of offsets the warmth as well. It's kind of what I like to do. And again, yeah, this one is almost like spinning the color scheme around. I painted this not long after the leopard. And my tendency is towards very warm colors, very sunny colors, lots of oranges and yellows. So every so often I try and force myself to paint a color scheme or use a palette that kind of the bias is purposely towards being a little bit cooler. And then I took this idea to the extreme here. And what I also did in this one was I chose to make the colors in the light, whilst not extremely warm, they've got this warmth to them, like this kind of oranginess, slight pinkiness, even a bit of yellow on the face. And then to really offset that, I made the colors in the shadows extremely cool, like lots of blues. Even the black stripes have got more of a bias of like a cool greeniness, a bit of Prussian blue in there. Just playing. So the light and shadow, the tonal values, again, they provide the structure of the painting. And when that structure is there, you know it's going to work visually. And for me, that then gives me so much freedom to play and be creative with not only the color, but also the way you're using the medium. So working more wet into wet where possible and simplifying large areas and that sort of thing. So it's always like the sort of underlying structure with tonal value actually gives us loads of freedom to play and experiment. And I think this is a good example of that as well. Yeah, and so this was also a demo for a course I ran probably a couple of years ago. And I think that particular course was actually quite heavily focused on tonal values. And the point being, again, and this is kind of a recurring thing in my work, particularly when I'm teaching, is can we just split the subject very simply into what I call the light family, and then can we split it into the shadow family? And when we do that, again, that gives us the structure. And when we have that structure, we can push color. And it's also a good example of what happens when you simplify large areas. So if you look at, say, the background and the way it kind of floats into the basket that the oranges are sitting in, which in turn kind of links into the underside of some of the oranges. And I'm always looking in watercolor for any opportunity to do large areas of wet into wet. So can I do large passages of wet into wet? All of those colors can kind of mingle. You can see there's some great granulation there from the ultramarine. So anywhere where there's a large area of similar-ish tone, and you do these big washes, you're opening yourself up to more interesting things happen that are born out of the medium. And as everyone here will know, with Daniel Smith and how well they granulate and all of those amazing things that they do, I'm always like, well, there's a great area of wet into wet where I can let the colors and the property of the colors really sing out. And I think this is, again, a good example of that. Yeah, and kind of the same thing again here. We've got simple light and shadow for the most part. Doesn't necessarily initially look like it, but it's all kind of grounded in simple light and shadow. And again, you know, look at the background on the left-hand side. Oh, Diane asked, did I save the lights on those oranges? I did, yep. I just almost, in the light first wash on the oranges, I just painted around the whites on the page and just kind of left them there. I've not really experimented much with masking fluid or anything like that. All of my highlights are left whites of the page. I don't mind using a little bit of opaque white here and there. If I've missed a highlight, I've got no problem with that.
Excuse me, I just have a question. Did you begin with the orange, or where are you beginning in that picture?
In the oranges, the previous one, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
In the oranges was the question, sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the oranges, yeah, I start with the oranges. I always start with that beautiful kind of warm yellow, which is probably New Gamboge, leaving all of those whites of the page. And then I don't always do it like this, but when I'm teaching, I quite often do lay down a lovely light family, lots of water, very splashy, reserving your lights, let that dry, and then I come in and I look for what I call a gentle shadow, which would be that sort of soft shadow on all of the oranges, the soft green. And then whilst that's still wet, I start to kind of drop in and load in a deeper dark. So I almost kind of break everything into threes all the time. We've got the light family, the gentle shadow, and the deep shadow. And I try not to make it too formulaic because it can feel a little bit like you're colouring in then, but it's almost like a nice simple process that you can follow, but it's quite kind of sensitive to the medium and how the medium works, and it sort of encourages colours to run and that sort of thing, that process.
Thank you so much.
Tom, I love your edges, the play of edges, soft and hard. That gives such a dynamic and emotion and movement to the painting. I love that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think edges is something that I'm always looking to explore, and I'm always trying to push it further. Like, can I get away with more soft edges, and also that play of harder edges and defined edges, and then more soft edges.
Lost and found edges. You nail it.
It's so much fun. So much fun. It's amazing what it can do. And I always say to people, if you ever not quite sure where you can lose edges, the shadows is a really good place to start. Like, you can lose edges in the light. And actually, quite often when I look at my work, I think, oh, I could afford to lose more edges in the light. But if you don't know where to start with lost and soft edges, I always say the shadows is a great place. Let your shadows merge together, let your shadows flow together, and then the few areas where the light hits and you get that little bit more definition, it's a nice place to start. You can break away from that. They're not hard rules, but it's not a bad place to start. Oh, thanks, actually. Yeah, so oh no, this was before we came live, but I was saying to a couple of people, I kind of stayed away from landscapes and seascapes for a long time just because I didn't really enjoy painting them. And then I kind of stumbled upon what I felt like my own way of painting them, which, as you can see, is quite kind of loose and fairly bold. And again, you know, it's in some ways it's quite kind of rough and ready when you look at it, but it's sort of grounded in tonal values in the rocks and then just kind of letting rip in the sky, basically. And this was a big painting. This was a full sheet watercolor and a massive brush. I don't have it anywhere near me, but really big brush that holds bucket loads of water. And I'm working on a slight tilt and just kind of, obviously with some plan and some level of sensitivity, but kind of just sloshing it on there, working through the tones, leaving lots of whites of the page, and really trying to leave the sky alone and not kind of fuss it, just keep it really simple. A few people are mentioning the sparkle on the sea. For me, that was like the real crux of the painting. So whilst I worked quickly, I was very aware that if I didn't quite get that sparkle on the sea, I'd kind of lose it a little bit. So that, in some ways, that was the most important bit. And then the rocks was just, funnily enough, I remember halfway through painting the rocks, I was just starting to think, oh, this is awful. It's really not working. I hate it, basically. And then that, I sort of detached from being so interested in end result then, almost to the point of like, well, this is another one in the bin. And I think because I let go of that attachment to an end result, I suddenly loosened up. And actually the rocks turned out far better when I tried less hard, basically, which is a good little kind of lesson to be learned, actually, that kind of slight detachment from an end result while still being aware of tonal values and the importance of paint consistency is an interesting balance to try and find. So this is in Pembrokeshire, actually, about 20 minutes down the road from where I live. And I saw someone there just in the chat type, it kind of looks like Northwest Pacific. And from the small amount I've seen of that area, there is a lot of similarity there, definitely. It's kind of rugged and wild, big skies, rough seas, big cliffs, that sort of thing. Yeah, fun one.
And that would be the last image here, Tom. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great. All right, I'll tell you what I'll do then. I'll flip my camera onto the overhead view and I'll quickly talk through my colours that came with the book and why I chose them. West Wales is underrated. I just thought I'd write that. It's a beautiful place. Yeah. Yeah, so just bear with me a sec while I flip the camera up. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is the book. It's been out a few months now. It was a lot of fun to make, create. It was really enjoyable. My first book, so very exciting. It had to be birds. Interestingly enough, birds was my very first word I ever said a long time ago. And when I was a kid, I was always painting birds. Well, actually, I was drawing birds because I didn't like painting. I didn't like colour, believe it or not. And so what was lovely about this is teaming up with the team at Daniel Smith and actually producing a little dot card that has come in the back of the book. And it's a selection of, 11 colours that are used in the book. The idea, to, as with the dot cards always, is to just give people a little insight into some of the colours. So as you can see, a lot of colour. In the book, I do actually we start very simply working wet into wet and there's lots of little bits on paint consistency, etc. But we start with creating blacks, but actually blacks with colour. So I've always liked Prussian blue and a warm red like Pyrrole red or Pyrrole scarlet, or even your cadmiums are a great way to create blacks, but they're blacks with a little bit of variation to them. And then as the book goes on, it kind of gets more complex, starting to introduce black, but with a bit of colour, building right up to working with lots more colour and eventually loads of colour. That was one of my favourites actually, and going through a whole kind of series of paintings, looking at markings, looking at colour mixing, and just trying to focus on keeping it simple but nice and expressive as well. And that's what I'm going to demo in a sec as a lovely toucan, but I'll quickly talk you through the colours that came in the book and why I love them so much. And they're not necessarily all the colours that I use all the time. I also have a slightly bigger dot card with a slightly more extensive range, but I can talk about these particular ones. So French ultramarine or ultramarine, depending on how I'm feeling or what's to hand. They are slightly different, but French ultramarine here is, I find it just a little bit softer and a little bit more gentle than ultramarine. And especially when it comes to mixes and kind of softer greys, of which there are a lot in this book, learning to mix soft greys, even in more colourful and striking subjects is really useful. And ultramarine blue, I just find such a lovely soft mixing blue, but it's also a very beautiful blue in its own right. It tends to granulate a little bit more than ultramarine, and it's just got ever so slightly a little bit more warmy purple feel to it, I find anyway, in the way I use it. The other colour was cobalt blue. So both of these are obviously a warm blue, but I like cobalt. It just gives something a little bit different. It's got a little bit more solidness to it, a little bit more opacity than French ultramarine. It just gives you slightly different greens, slightly different greys. It just gives you something a little bit different. And great, I love cobalt blue kind of thrown into skies as well to introduce another element. And then I have two cool blues. So I would say Prussian blue is my kind of go-to cool blue. I find it very user-friendly. It can create beautiful, rich, lush darks. It's got that strong bias towards green because of its coolness, so you can get some really vibrant greens with it. And again, because of its transparency, I find it a really lovely mixing blue, but when you want to shift the bias towards cools and but you also want really deep darks. Prussian blue, as I said, with a Pyrrole scarlet, you've got an immediate black, but a black that's got like some depth and some vibrancy to it as well. And then phthalo blue, the green shade, again, it's a beautiful blue, but I feel like it's quite a specialist blue. I feel it can really easily dominate your mixes and even completely take over your palette. However, it's also got this extremely green bias. It's almost turquoise, the green shade. And therefore, if you want extremely vibrant greens, you can get them with phthalo blue. I also find, for example, if you've got something like a blue jay and you want a really punchy blue, your phthalo blue is going to give you that. Prussian blue is a little bit more subdued and grey, particularly something like a kingfisher. When you want that punchy, really intense blue, ultramarine's not going to give it to you too warm. The more opaque colours sometimes don't quite have the hit that you want. And then the phthalo blue, it just gives you that really intense blue. And also when it hits yellows, that turns them really vibrant green as well. So I think of it more as like not normally on my palette, but if I want it for very specific reasons. Then a warm and a cool red, quinacridone red. I love quinacridone red because it's so versatile. It is a cooler red, but it's also like higher chroma and stronger than alizarin crimson, and a little bit more vibrant. And because of that vibrancy, you can still get relatively strong oranges with it. Like an alizarin crimson is always going to give us a more muted orange. It's going to give us beautiful, rich kind of red wine colors. But quinacridone red, you don't necessarily need a warm red as well. It's extremely versatile, quinacridone red. And then if I do specifically want that really hot fire engine red, I love Pyrrol red, I love Pyrrol scarlet. Although they're kind of semi-opaque, I find them to just be a little bit lighter and more gentle than, say, some of the cadmiums. So on the whole, I prefer them because they just feel a bit more gentle. And the same with the yellows. We've got a warm and a cool yellow. So I love New Gamboge because it's so orangey and so hot and warm, but yet it's beautiful and transparent. So I really love it in my mixes. And then my cool yellow is Aureolin in this particular book. I've actually more recently ended up shifting to lemon a little bit more when I want a cooler yellow. But in this case, and also Indian yellow. I love Indian yellow if I'm only going to use one yellow and I want lots of versatility. I use Indian yellow, and here I've just split it into a cool and a warm. Aureolin is more soft and gentle than lemon and can be a little bit easier to manage, but lemon has got that kind of acid punch to it when you really want a strong green. You start mixing Aureolin and Thaler or Prussian, you get extremely vibrant greens. Cobalt turquoise it opens up your yellows and your blues to a whole new part of the color wheel. Just the addition of cobalt turquoise, or my other favorite color, cobalt teal blue, and you kind of blow your color wheel wide open with just one addition of a color. Great for creating cooler greens, but it's also beautiful as a color by itself. As is cobalt teal blue. And both of these, interestingly, they're actually really great for mixing kind of soft greys as well. They're a bit of a dark horse in that sense. You can use them neat, they're beautiful, but they're great mixing colors. And then very finally, yes.
Here's a quick question, a great question from Letty. She said, what about yellow ochre shades? Do you sometimes use yellow ochres or do you mix them?
Yeah, great question. I love yellow ochre and raw sienna. I obviously they've got differences, but I kind of group them together as beautiful earthy yellows. And yeah, absolutely. I really stripped back the colors for this particular book, but in the grander scheme of my painting, I love yellow ochre and I love raw sienna, and I'm on a bit of a kind of raw sienna phase at the moment for some reason, but I love yellow ochre as well. And not only are they beautiful colors in their own right, I actually love them for mixing. Again, you can mix such beautiful soft grays with yellow ochre and raw sienna. And actually the next color I'm going to talk about, lavender, which is a lot more, this is actually the gouache when I look at it, but lavender watercolor. I love this color. It's quite heavy. It's only listed as a semi-opaque color, but to me, it has the properties of quite a heavy opaque color, but in a good way, the way it behaves. And one of my favorite mixes for kind of soft grays that can swing more towards yellow or more towards kind of purples and blues is yellow ochre and lavender. It's such a fantastic mix and I absolutely love it. And yellow ochre, quite often if I'm painting buildings and things, I love yellow ochre or raw sienna where you just want like a subtle undertone of warmth to the face of a building where the sun's hitting it or something like that. That's where I really find it comes into its own. Like this was a little demo I did yesterday, and it's a good example of where just a little hint of raw sienna or yellow ochre can just give you that little bit of warmth and sunlight. And yeah, of course you can mix it, but sometimes it's just nice having it in the tube kind of ready to go. And also it's actually a great color for landscapes because you can it's very rare that all of our greens are the same. And actually, when you start to look at the greens, particularly here in the UK, this is funnily enough the Lake District, quite often the brighter greens are punctuated with little pockets of yellow ochre or raw sienna. That's slightly different colour. So it's such a versatile colours, definitely. And then very finally, titanium white. So I'm more and more using titanium white in some of my mixes in very specific kind of circumstances, more in landscapes. The titanium white here is really just if you miss a highlight in the eye. And with these birds, the highlight is such a little cherry on top of a painting that I think if you miss it, it's worth having a titanium white just to pop it back in. And the bird suddenly kind of comes to life and looks at you and you go, ah, there we go, I got it. Or I didn't, if it didn't work. But yeah, titanium white useful at the end. So
Tom,
okay,
what kind of paper will you be using today?
Today I'm using Bao Hong paper. It's one of my favorite papers. This is the rough texture. It's the Bao Hong Master's Choice. This is A3 size. And I love it because it stays wet a long time. It has a lot of texture, so it tends to encourage granulation. So it's a beautiful combination with the Daniel Smith. And you'll see a lot of, as you know, probably most of you, the Daniel Smith, a lot of the ambassadors seem to use also Bao Hong paper as well. It just seems to be a nice combo. They work well together. I use the cold press a lot as well. It's beautiful. I do also use Saunders Waterford, a couple of Canson papers, and a few other bits and bobs. But Bao Hong's the one I come back to more often than not, particularly for birds and wildlife, which is what I paint a lot of. Okay, so I'm not using all of those colours for this painting. I've got ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, new gamboge because I want to get the warmth in the beak. I do also have the Cogley yellow out as well. Mine's actually lemon yellow, but aureolin yellow would give you the same thing in this case because I want some of those bright greens in the background. The Prussian blue with quinacridone red is going to give me really deep darks. If it goes too purple, you can just chuck in a bit of yellow to kind of mute it down a little bit. And I think I'm just going to go for it. It's a good example of kind of light and shadow. If we look at it very quickly, the beak is split into light and shadow. The white here is split into light and shadow. The eye, light and shadow. Even the black feathers are far from just black. They've got brown, they've got blue. They're actually quite light in some areas. Great opportunity for lots of wet into wet and throwing the colour around a little bit. And we'll chuck a bit of colour in the background as well. So I'm going to use a nice big mop brush to start, and we're just going to slosh a load of paint down, basically. It never sounds very technical, but that's where we're kind of starting. So I'm going to get a little bit of new gamboge yellow, the much warmer yellow, down on the beak. And I'm going to start in a fairly controlled way, plenty of water. Leave a little bit of light on the front edge of the beak, just there. And then as I come into the background, I don't mind having the slightly warmer yellow creep into the background, but I might also introduce some of that lemon yellow. And I tend to, the beak obviously needs a little bit more control, I find, in other areas. So I tend to take a bit of care to get that working. And then almost just to loosen me up, I then kind of just splash the paint around a bit. It stops me from being too fussy too soon. So it's just whatever it takes to kind of just keep things loose at this early stage. Nice and splashy. It's always a good way to start. You can always tighten up a little bit later if we want to, but I like to start kind of loose and splashy. And then that's very watery. And then after that, we can start to throw in like a slightly stronger yellow in places. So we bring up the paint consistency to be a little bit thicker. And then we'll do the same. So the eye is probably the most controlled part of this. I'm going to start with the yellow because it's the weaker color. So we can always put the blue back on top of the yellow, a little bit trickier the other way around. And I'm really just blocking in what I would call the light family. So I'm not really aiming to go right down to shadow tone yet. The white, we'll get to that later. It's all about just getting something down to start with. And I say this a lot when I'm teaching. So this is ultramarine blue and French ultramarine and quinacridone red, beautiful purple, because they've both got that bias towards purple already. It's almost a bit too purpley, so sticking a bit of, bit of Prussian. And what I'm doing here is I'm kind of exaggerating what I can see. So I can see some warmth up here. I get those lovely kind of wings in place. So I'm wanting to work quickly, but there's also an accuracy kind of needed as well. So it's kind of trying to find that balance between nice and loose and kind of free, but accuracy where it's needed. So I tend to use the phrase simple yet accurate. So it's simple colors, simple washes, kind of fairly simple techniques, but where it's needed, there is a certain level of accuracy that comes in. Now, it's a great example of the Bao Hong paper and how it stays nice and damp. Like there's a lovely dampness here. Anyone that knows Wales, where I live, will also know that it's quite a damp place. So that is perfect watercolor country. And what I'm doing here is kind of laying in the light side, or the light family of the darker feathers, so that I can kind of work wet into wet. Annoyingly, these legs on feet can't really be avoided. I'm usually great at avoiding painting feet, but they can't really be avoided here. So we just keep them really simple. But that's kind of the action area, as it were. So if I can just get away with a very simple version of the feet. Come in here. You can see all of these lovely colours just flowing together. It's really just a couple of colours. But what I'm aiming for here is that I eventually want to get to the, let's come out a little bit thicker with that quinacridone red. There we go, that lovely rich quinacridone red. You could use alizarin crimson, but it doesn't quite have that same punch in this particular instance. So kind of keep it all flowing. I'd like to see a little bit more interaction between background and the bird. So actually I'm going to sort of do a few slightly more interesting things. I'm going to take some of the turquoise and I'm going to mix that in. Let's go a bit of Prussian blue and turquoise. A little bit of yellow left on there, doesn't really matter which yellow. And then actually what I'd like to see more of is some of that background colour kind of working its way into the bird a little bit more, and vice versa. So a little bit more interaction between background and animal. It just helps it feel less kind of cut out. And this is a great example of what I love about these turquoises. These turquoises kind of dropped into other colours, for me, do really interesting things. And then we can kind of carve the shape out in a moment. Let's get a little bit more of that green happening. And
we've got some brush questions. What size is that brush?
Okay, so these are pan art brushes. I was involved in helping to kind of design these, just tweak them a little bit from the original ones. And they're beautiful brushes. They've got this lovely densified wood. So it's actually soft wood, but it's been densified and dyed. So you get a beautiful handle. And then you get these amazing big bodies that come to these super fine points. And I basically, all the brushes I use are these pan art brushes, just of different sizes. I've just got a whole range of them for everything. And every so often, if I need to drop down to a smaller one, there's a pointed round as well. But most of my brushes are these. And that is the size 16 I'm using. Oh, excuse me. That's a big sneeze. Yeah, size 16. So it's just just big enough to get the paint flowing, but it's also small enough when you need that kind of little bit of accuracy. You've kind of got it. So I'm trying to kind of have a bit of green in the background, and I'm almost wanting that green to run into the bird as well. The reason I've not painted the head yet is because I didn't want the darker colours of the head to run into that really clean, vibrant yellow that I put around the eye. So holding the brush just a touch further down gives us a bit more control. And now we've got all of these wonderful colours kind of running together. We can have a play in there if you want to. And that's kind of the first pass on it. I always say if it's just a nice colourful mess at this stage, it's all good. So I saw someone asking then, so pan art brushes, it's PANART.
So Tom, how do you choose the colors? Because I have a real problem not being completely literal. I look at that picture and it's a black bird. And I look at your beautiful colors and I have a hard time doing what you're doing.
Yes, no, I know exactly what you mean. I struggled with color for a long, long time. I almost think of myself as like a tonal painter. So I paint light and shadow. And that gives us a bit more freedom with color in some ways. So that's a good place to start, is focus on tone, and the color matters less. It's not, it doesn't matter, not at all, but it matters less. And beyond that, sometimes I'm pulling out from the photo some color that's there, but I'm exaggerating it. So when I look at this bird on my screen and with my eyes, and everyone sees color differently, okay, yeah, it's a black bird, but when I look here, I can see like a warmth to it. And when I look over here, I can see a coolness to it. And so I tend to think not in terms of color, literally, I tend to think in terms of cool and warm.
Okay.
And I find, so thinking tonally and thinking in terms of cool and warm helps me a lot. And it also helps me exaggerate color. So I say, well, that's just a warm, kind of a warm color. So I'll mix a sort of a warm color and I'll pop that in there. And then whether it's actually the literal color or not, it almost doesn't matter too much.
Because your paintings are beautiful and I'd love to be able to paint that way.
I think, yeah, focus on tone and don't be afraid to push away from color. I think another thing that people get lost with though is also, and this is so particularly with Daniel Smith and all of these wonderful colors to choose from, is quite often people have almost too many colors out on their palette. And that can be one of the big struggles is, well, I've got so many colors out, I struggle to make a colorful painting that balances color-wise, like the colors don't necessarily harmonize or work well together. But if you strip your color palette back down to even just 3 colors to start with, and then build from there, color mixing becomes so much simpler and your colors will naturally harmonize. If you just focus on tone using a fairly limited palette, your colors will naturally kind of harmonize and you'll have to try a lot less to make them work. So that can also open up a whole new world of color to people.
Thank you.
Start working with a more limited palette.
Thanks.
Nothing wrong with owning, 200 colors, but when it comes to one painting, might be more advisable to at least kick off with just a few colors. Makes things a little bit easier. So what I'm doing here is working wet into wet. I'm using that beautiful rich Prussian blue, which I love so much, and mixing it with the warmer red gives us a beautiful color. And just trying to encourage these colors to run a little bit more. Now these are all going to dry a little bit lighter and there's room to kind of push some really deep darks in, but that's got to quite a nice stage there. There's a bit of a handful of a mess going on here. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. One of the great things about this Bao paper is it's extremely forgiving and you can kind of pull color out a little bit. Might be a nice opportunity to use some lavender as well. So lavender and its little bit of opacity and its kind of heaviness. I'm just going to check the time because I'm aware that we don't have loads of time and I do want to get to the good bit over here. So I'm just going to pull out some of this excess water. So what I love about lavender is that slight heaviness and that opacity that it has. Again, it's listed as being a semi-opaque color, which it is in terms of the pigment itself, but in terms of the way it behaves, the pigment is quite heavy and it tends to do sort of very different things to say a fully transparent color or even some of the other more semi-opaque colors. And so it's great for kind of placing back into a dark area. So say you've got this really large dark area and there's nothing wrong with it as it is, but maybe I want to inject a bit more life into it. A little splash of lavender can go a long way. And because of its heaviness, it does really interesting things that you can drop it in and it kind of bleeds out and creates all of these wonderful kind of effects and little almost tendrils of paint, and you can do some really cool stuff with it. The trick is not to go overboard. Because of its heaviness, you can kind of kill an area a little bit. You can make it go a little bit dead and heavy if there's too much of that opacity, but a little touch of it can kind of go a long way. And it's a really fun color. The cobalt teal is not quite as heavy and doesn't behave in quite the same way, the cobalt teal blue, but it's not dissimilar. You can kind of place a cobalt teal blue back into an area. I'm kind of just showing you a few different things here, just while we've got the time. It's great kind of brushed back into a lovely deep, rich dark. You can really inject some life into an area. As you can see, I could play and play and play in this area. Not necessarily a good thing. It's not even necessarily going to make it a better painting, but we can do. And then what I'm looking for here, why I've kind of waited, is I want to now look at the shadow here. So we look at this area here. We say, oh, that's white, but it's white in sunlight, and it's also white in shadow. And that white in shadow is an opportunity to use that slightly softer kind of French ultramarine colour. If it's a bit too strong, you've always got the option, tiny touch of red, tiny touch of yellow, and we just sort of grey it down. But on the whole, we've just got this beautiful shadow that kind of floats along here. So dropping down to the same brush, but a smaller size, the pan art mop. And I'm hoping to just kind of hit that dark area here and kind of lose an edge, get a slightly soft edge in there. So I tend to establish a shadow in quite a harsh sort of dominant way like that. And then I come in with a damp, clean brush and just sort of hit the edge in a couple of places. So we soften that edge down. It just sort of gentles, it makes more gentle the transition between light and shadow. You don't want to do it everywhere because you want some hard edges between light and shadow, but at the same time, we do want some softer edges as well. So trying to find that balance between, I think Ashley mentioned this, between kind of soft and hard edges.
Yeah.
And
I know you're kind of
play.
I know you're busy painting, and that's awesome. So when you have a second, there's been a request to see the reference photo again. So just whenever you have a second.
Yeah, of course. No, that's fine. If I hold it onto one side, you can kind of see what we're going for.
So basically, you're not looking at color necessarily. You're just looking at value or tone, as you say.
Pretty much, yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, kind of focusing just on value, and that in many ways that gives us freedom then. Gives us a lot of freedom. So if you get those tonal values, I don't even like using the word right because it kind of implies the wrong sort of approach. But if we get them working within the context of the painting, then that gives us so much freedom with colour. I think that's where the real freedom lies in watercolour. Okay, so I'm just taking a moment to clean my palette. I'm aware that we don't have loads of time, but I want to get the beak working and chuck a little bit of background in there. So it's a good opportunity as well to talk about where you picking your hits. So here we can be very abstract and bold and do whatever. Not whatever, but to a point. And then here we might need to be a little bit more precise. So I'm going to come in with my quinacridone red, that beautiful red. And even though quinacridone red, as I was saying, has that bias towards coolness, and as we've seen, gives us extremely vibrant purples because of its cool bias, it's also high chroma enough that you can create an incredibly vibrant orange. So it kind of swings both ways between warm and cool. And I think if you were traveling or you wanted to really strip back your palette but still wanted a bit of versatility, quinacridone red is going to give you that. It's going to give you enough. It's very rare that unless you want an extremely hot orange or that fire engine red specifically, it's very rare that the quinacridone red won't get you where you want to go, but it's also got that beautiful coolness. The only time you might want to mix it up a little bit is if you want an extremely cool red, and I tend to shift over. I love quinacridone reds, and as we know, Daniel Smith has an amazing array of quinacridone colours, and I think their quinacridone colours are fantastic. I love them. They're vibrant, they're transparent, they're intense, particularly as a transparent colour. And they appear to have extreme light fastness as well, so they kind of tick all the boxes. And so I tend to drop down to like your quinacridone pinks, your quinacridone rose, that sort of colour, if I want kind of more coolness. But the quinacridone red, great sort of go-to versatile all-rounder as a red, but still with beautiful transparency. So as we come in here, there's a little bit of dampness on the page still, so I'm kind of just struggling a little bit to control everything, but it's okay. This one is kind of the flip side of the Bao Hong. Sometimes you actually, I'd kind of be nice if this would dry a little bit faster, but it doesn't always want to do that. But as we get into the thicker colours now, so Prussian blue and either of the reds, but I'm sticking with quinacridone just for simplicity. And we're up to our kind of Marmite, Vegemite, peanut butter paint consistency. And that's when I start to place that into our existing damp washes, we're going to get a softness to the edges, but at the same time, it's going to stay where it's put a little bit more. So there's a touch more control as I drift into those colours. So we're kind of moving up through the paint consistencies. We've done watery, we've done kind of milky and creamy, and I'm now right up at our sort of, well, here in the UK we call it double cream. I think a lot of other places we're talking about whipping cream, but it's that paint consistency, not the colour, but the paint consistency. And as I start to pop these marks in, I do want them to soften into the surrounding area so that we get some of these lovely soft edges, but I also want a bit more control as well. So that's what I'm aiming for at the moment.
Tom, while I'm painting, often I find the quinacridone family dries faster than the other pigments. Do you find that in your experience also, or no?
I have to say I've never noticed that, but it might be partly because the paper that I use, it just stays wet for so long. I've not really noticed it. That's really interesting though, because I have noticed it with other colours, the drying times, the amount the colours spread out as well. I've always found quinacridones quite controllable actually in terms of how much they spread out. And that's partly due to the paper as well. But yeah, no, that's really interesting though. I've not noticed that per se, but now you've said that, I'm definitely going to be looking out for it.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
It also depends where you are. I mean, in England, it's very, the humidity. And with me in California, everything dries fast.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's not, colours drying too fast is not a problem we have here in the UK. even on a hot day. Not a problem.
And here in Montreal, we go from minus 40 Celsius to plus 40 Celsius. So we have to adjust constantly.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, we've got it so easy in the UK as watercolourists. Way too easy. Funnily enough, I'm actually going out to teach in Zambia next Tuesday. In fact, it's feeling scarily close. So that's going to be a whole different ball game of how quickly colours dry. I think it's almost like you put it down and it'll be dry before you've even blinked. So that'll be an adjustment, definitely.
Are you doing that with Art Safari?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Say hi to Marianne for me.
I will do, yeah. Marianne's coming out with me. It's my first time, so I'm very, very grateful that she's also going to be there. Yeah, I'm so looking forward to that though. It's going to be incredible. Okay, so you can see paper weight is 300 GSM. Every so often I just catch someone asking a question. Okay, I'm aware that I do need to pick up the pace a little bit if we're going to sort of bring this to some sort of finish. Now, we're going fairly well, but there's about 12 minutes left. So let's keep it moving. I need to get the blue in on the eye. So I'm dropping down to a much smaller pointed round here, and I'm going to ultramarine blue, but fairly neat. Because not neat in terms of paint consistency, but neat as a mix. There's no other color in the mix here. Just that beautiful vibrancy. And you can see that's ultramarine with a tiny bit of red and yellow, almost imperceptible amount. And you get this beautiful softness to it. It's not quite gray, but it's a very, very soft blue. But then ultramarine by itself, you've got that intensity of blue. And this is what I love about ultramarine. It is actually a very vibrant, intense color. French ultramarine, a little bit softer. But as soon as you add it to other colors, because it's very transparent, it's very gentle as blues go, it's also a fantastic mixing blue. And that's why it always finds its way onto my palette, either French ultramarine or ultramarine. And you can see here, we're getting that lovely softness. There's a tiny, it's probably not showing up on camera, but because of the ultramarine in the mix, we're also getting some beautiful granulation in places. And again, that's one of the other joys of these colors. So we need to, I need to get a move on here. We're not far off, but there's still a little bit to do in the background. The eye needs sort of bringing to life. So I'm tending to think if I ever get stuck, I go back to light and shadow. So I've got the light family of the yellow around the eye. So that tells me I now need to go to the gentle shadow, which is a little bit thicker in paint consistency and a touch more red. And if I get stuck, that just gives me a way to go. So I'm now going to that colour there. And that's starting to give us a little bit more kind of form and shape. So the joy of tonal values is not only does it gives structure to the painting, it also gives form and roundness, and it even gives us a process in watercolor. My process is quite sort of based on tonal values. So we're starting watery in the light family, and then we're slowly moving into the gentle shadow, which tends to drift into kind of full fat milk, single cream paint consistency. And then eventually we're sort of moving towards the deeper darks, and that is that slightly thicker paint consistency. There we go.
Tom, Gina likes your painting, but she also likes your paper towel.
Oh.
Kitchen roll. I'm sorry.
Oh, the kitchen
Wrong
roll
country.
over here. Yeah. It looks great, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Oh, it's not so much these days in watercolor, but I used to do a lot of acrylic painting and a lot of teaching of acrylics. And I'd get so many comments about how beautiful my palette looked. I'm sitting there slaving away on a painting, and everyone's talking about how beautiful the palette looks. And it did. It was a kind of a work. I think I've still got my acrylic palette somewhere. I hate to think how many pounds worth of paints are piled up on there that won't ever get used, but there we go. And you can almost see once we get that eye in, we're kind of away then. And what I'm trying to balance here is a little bit more control in this area, and then it kind of plays off the abstractness of this area over here. And I personally, I love that play of abstract and more refined areas. So we're kind of pushing towards dry brush and finishing touches here. So quinacridone red neat is going to give us that lovely richness of red in there, even a little bit of red's kind of striped back in here. So thick paint, even when transparent, transparent quinacridone red, but used thick, is great for just injecting back into areas. And what I increasingly am enjoying in my painting is that combination of transparency and free-flowing transparent washes, that lovely softness that you get with watercolor, contrasted with a little bit of opaque color and a little bit of thick color. It's not to everyone's taste in their own painting, but it's something I'm doing increasingly more and enjoying. So we need a little bit of background, and then the cherry on top is going to be that eye right at the end. I'm not feeling that we need a huge amount of background over here, because I don't want to compete for attention with the darkness of the wings, but I think slightly darker color in the background here to trap the light on the front edge of the beak is going to work nicely. And then I'll bring a little bit of that background out on the other side just to create some level of continuity. I'm not too fussed about the way the red's bled into the background here, but I didn't want it all the way along the bottom, because then it's literally just making the beak look the wrong shape. Okay, so if you just bear with me, I think 5 minutes to finish off, and then if anyone obviously has any questions at the end or now, I'm quite happy for people to ask questions continually as we go. So let's go to a smaller brush, get it nice and clean. I want a nice clean green here. So the new Gamboge in all its glory and its warmth is fantastic, but it's never going to give us the bright greens that an aureolin or a lemon yellow is going to give. A cooler yellow, your Hansa yellow light is not a bad one either, but I tend to favour the aureolin and the lemon yellow because they're just a little bit more transparent and a touch lighter. And I tend to favour that in a lot of my colours. So mostly yellow, tiny touch of Prussian blue because it's got that bias towards green. And I'm just going to start trapping the light on the beak here. So I'm using the negative shape of the background to trap the light on the positive shape of the beak. So, and I tend to start where I need to be accurate. And once I've got that, and then just sort of do a little bit of that and take it off the side and have a play. I don't necessarily feel I need to define every single edge perfectly. I'm going to come up to meet there. And I tend to start light just while I feel my way with a colour. And then once I've kind of felt my way with it a bit, and I'm going to bring it out the other side, but not hugely, just maybe a little bit here. Even if it bleeds into the beak a little bit, that could actually be quite nice. And you'll see I kind of have this approach of like, do a big shape, kind of wiggle it about a bit, do a couple of shapes away from it, anything to kind of inject that movement into it. And you can see those kind of lost and found edges, those soft edges, they kind of, I'm always thinking about them because I really love them, but they're not sort of overly considered. They're almost like a byproduct of the approach of the painting, if that makes any sense. Like I am considering them. And when I have large areas of shadow or darker colors, that's a great opportunity. So that's always a good thing. Can I sometimes lose edges between the object and the background? Another opportunity for soft edges, but it needs to be contrasted with some hard edges in some places. So here we've got a dark object against a light background, and here we've got a light object against a dark background. So those are two opportunities for harder edges. Whereas here we've got a dark object against the dark background, and that's a great opportunity to start losing edges. So whilst there is some consideration, it's also born ever so slightly out of the process as well. And then just trying to get that dark to feed up into the rest of the painting. And these background colors, I'm a one for quite abstract backgrounds when it comes to birds. I don't generally paint leaves and backgrounds and things like that, and not there's anything wrong with it at all. It's more because I've tried a few times and just don't like it and not very good at it. But I tend to like these backgrounds and the way that they can add a lot of movement to a bird, especially a flying bird like this. You know, this bird wants to feel like there's movement and lots of character. And I think the more lost edges you have, the less you define everything, the more you get that sense of movement. And I think the more I go in and try and paint specific leaves and branches, particularly a flying bird, for me, you kind of lose that fresh, explosive feeling that I think that I want a flying bird to have. We're right on the finish here.
You mentioned phthalo blue. Is it red shade or green shade?
It's the green shade, yeah. I mean, the red shade is beautiful. It makes some such wonderful colors. The reason I chose the green shade for this one are those times when you want that real bias towards green. You want a particularly vibrant green, particularly in some of the birds that are in the book. You just want a very specific vibrant green. And then also there are just some birds that have that such intense blue, it's just impossible to get it with anything else except a very, very greeny phthalo blue. But yeah, I do every so often use phthalo blue red shade as well. It produces some wonderful purples. They're just such strong colors, the phthalos, though. I think they're quite hard to manage. They can be a little bit tricky to handle. It's amazing. You pop that eye in and the whole animal comes to life. And all I've done is paint a bit of red in a circle and left a white bit of the page, but you know, it's enough to bring that bird to life. Okay, so I kind of sped through this fairly quickly, but in some ways, some of my favorite paintings are the ones where they're created with a kind of quite a lot of speed, because it's how I like to paint anyway. And if I'm given 2 hours to do a painting, I'll sort of fill it with 2 hours of painting, and it's not necessarily a better painting for it. And actually, if you have half an hour to do a painting, sometimes it can have a kind of freshness and a spontaneity to it because you've been forced not to fiddle and play around. I have to say, I love putting tape around things like this because you get the joy of then taking the tape off.
We love the tape peel around here.
Oh my gosh.
So
it's satisfying. The best bit, isn't it? This is on a gummed block as well, so there's no need for me to tape it. But it's I love the gummed blocks. They're so convenient and easy, but I also love a little bit of an edge around it, and it just finishes it off nicely. So I think we're pretty much there.
I wanted to mention something to everybody. Tom just did a fantastic interview with Jackson's Art. So you can go over to Jackson's, either their YouTube channel or their website, and see that. It's fantastic. And he also does another demo.
Yeah, we were talking about that before, weren't we? And the guys at Jackson's are so fantastic, and they've done such an amazing job of that video. So yeah, And they've got so many other artists on there that they interview. And also, as most people know, but there's also a fantastic interview with John.
Yes.
John on there as well, which is so interesting. It's brilliant.
Wonderful. Well,
So,
I'm acting
I'll
for
leave it
John
there.
today, and just wanted to say thank you so much for this demo and
My
for
pleasure.
your time. Is there anything else you want to share before we go?
I don't think so. No, I think I've said everything I need to say.
We've had, let's see, 192 right now, but we've had over 200 people today, and there's a whole bunch more in Facebook. So you attract quite a crowd.
That's amazing. Wow, that's really incredible.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tom. Thanks everyone so much.
Thank you,
Great to see everyone.
Tom. It was amazing.
Thank you so much.
Have a
Thank
good
you so
weekend.
much.
Thank you.